Britain tells the story of abolition, there's always a strange silence in the middle, a conveniently missing detail. We're told that in 1833, Britain ended slavery, but what we're not told, what most of us were never taught, is how Britain ended it and who got paid. Because when freedom finally came for over 800,000 enslaved Africans across the British Empire, the British state didn't compensate the enslaved for generations of stolen labor. No. Britain wrote the biggest check in its history to the enslavers. In 1833, under the Slavery Abolition Act, legislated by Prime Minister Charles Grey, the same Earl Grey your tea bag is named after, Parliament set aside £20 million to pay slave owners for their loss of their human property. In fact, let me correct the number straight away, okay? £20 million in the 1830s. In today's value, scholars estimate between 16 and 20 billion pounds. According to HM Treasury's own Freedom of Information release, that 20 million represented 40% of all government spending that year. 40%, one of the biggest public payouts in British history. And how did Britain raise the money, you ask? It borrowed it. £15 million from the bankers Rothschild and Montefiore, and £5 million issued as government stock. This was Britain buying itself out of slavery and putting the cost on the national credit card. So who actually received the money? Here's where the archives get uncomfortable. The University College London Legacies of British Slave Ownership Project, the most comprehensive database we have, documents over 46,000 individual claims. 46,000 people who lined up to be paid for owning other human beings. And according to UCL's analysis, around half of the entire compensation fund, about £10 million, right, went not to plantation owners living in the Caribbean, no, but to absentee owners living comfortably here in Britain. And who were these people? Members of Parliament, bishops of the Church of England, aristocrats with country estates, bankers, merchants, and industrialists. Oh, let's not forget British society's most respectable families. We have names. Henry Philpotts, Bishop of Exeter, received £12,700 for 665 enslaved people. Henry Lascelles, 2nd Earl of Hereward, he received £26,309 for 2,554 enslaved Africans. These are the same families, mind you, who shaped the Victorian elite. They were directly enriched by the abolition settlement. Now let's talk about how this money didn't just end slavery, it fertilized British capitalism. The Bank of England administered the payouts. Most of the money wasn't given as cash. It was issued as government stock, interest-bearing securities, basically wealth in paper form. A 2022 Bank of England working paper analyzed 13,500 of these transactions. It shows slave owner compensation being traded, inherited, mortgaged, and reinvested. In other words, slave compensation became liquid capital. It flowed directly into the city of London, into banking, into credit markets, into the early financial infrastructure that still underpins Britain today. You don't need to be a historian to understand what that means. When you give a class of people assets that can be traded, borrowed against, and passed down, what are you doing? You're creating generational wealth. What does slave owner money build? Railways. Slavery built the tracks. Using UCL data, the London Reconnection Research found 175 individuals connected to slavery who made 487 railway investments totaling over 16.5 million in the 19th century capital. John Moss, he received £40,353 in compensation, right? And with that money, he invested over 222,000 into railways. Thomas Dunlop Douglas, he received £15,907 and he pumped £396,000 into the new railway companies. These men financed the early lines that became the backbone of Britain's modern transport network. The London and Birmingham Railway, the Great Western Railway. So yes, the trains you ride today were partly funded by slavery money. Yes, UCL's research traces slave owner wealth into Britain's physical landscape. Country houses, expanded estates, art collections, and libraries. The money also entered public life too. Compensation recipients became MPs, local governors, founders of philanthropic institutions, and patrons of universities. This was respectability, moral laundering. It turned slave money into social status. The families who benefited became part of the Victorian ruling class, and many of those lineages remain influential today. Let's look at a few historians. How do they summarize this? You got Nicholas Draper, the leading scholar on compensation. He calls the records a complete census of slave ownership. His research shows that compensation didn't circulate in the Caribbean. It circulated in Britain. Then we have UCL's impact study. This is what it says. It says that slave compensation is woven into British banking, commerce, politics, culture, and architecture. So when we talk about Victorian Britain, you know, it's railways, it's estates, it's financial might. What we're talking about the wealth that was seeded by slavery and fertilized by compensation. Let's get rid of this myth right now. Let's do it. Let's do it right here. Britain did not simply abolish slavery. Britain bought itself out of it, and the people who walked away with that money were the people who had owned Africans. That compensation didn't end in the 19th century. It built industries, it built estates, it built financial systems, and it built families. The enslaved received nothing. The enslavers received the largest government payout in British history. And if you want to understand modern Britain, its wealth, its inequality, its aristocracy, you have to start right here.